Welcome to the House of Truth. Last week we talked about dealing with people wisely, and we wrapped up that part of our series on wisdom about wisdom in relationships with people in general. Today we're going to talk about the story of Purim or Purim, whichever you prefer, and look and see how those principles are applied throughout the story, where people are wise and where they're foolish, based on what we've learned so far. And we're going to begin here in Esther chapter 1, verse 7 through 11. And they gave them drink in vessels of gold, and the vessels being diverse from there, and the royal wine in abundance, according to the state of the king. And the drinking was according to the law, none did compel. The king so appointed all officers of his house that they should do according to every man's pleasure. And Vashti the queen made a feast of the women of the royal house which belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman and Biztha and Harmona, Bigtha, Abagath, Zethar, and Carcass, the seven chamberlains that served in the presence of Ahasuerus the king, to bring Vashti the queen before the king with a royal crown, to show the people and the prince their beauty, for she was fair to look upon. Okay, now there's several things here. There's several things in it right here. One is a subtle one we'll miss is the women are separated from the men. And that was actually wise because they were drinking. Because as we saw recently about when we looked about wisdom with women, men and women can make poor decisions and fall into lust for each other, and people don't even like can end up in bed, waking up naked the next day, going, "How do we even get here?" So that's the one wise thing they perhaps did in this whole thing. But the problem is the whole thing itself is unwise. Remember, Solomon says it's not fitting for kings and rulers to drink alcohol. And this guy's not just had this week party we're seeing here. Before that, he did this for 180 days. And he made an announcement that he's having a week festival, not just for his people that had been entertaining before, but for the whole city, for the whole palace to participate in. So that was not wise at all. And because he got drunk, because he was drinking too much, his heart was merry with wine. He had drank too much. He gets this idea in his head he normally wouldn't have got to have his queen come out wearing her royal crown and basically parade her in front of everyone like she's his prize horse. And generally, the only people that saw the queen was the king, and if you might bring her out with maybe to greet special guests and stuff. This was not like Queen Elizabeth in England. They had television, and everyone saw her. Was part of it's generally part of the dignity of being the queen. And he's going to reserve her for himself, and even let people see her. He's going to reserve the Persians would reserve them for just special occasions, dignitaries, things like that. Perhaps her own parents, things like that. But he's parading her in front of everyone, which was very insulting to her in the Persian culture at the time. Now we're continue on Esther chapter 1, verse 12 through 15, and we're going to see her response to this. And remember, she's been drinking also. But the queen Vashti refused to come at the king's commandment by his chambers. Therefore, the king was very wroth, and his anger burned in him. When the king said to the wise men which knew the times, for so is the king's manner towards all that knew law and judgment. And the next to him was Karshina, and Shetha, and Admatha, Tarshish, Merez, Marcina, and Mecumen, the seven princes of Persia and Media, which saw the king's face and which sat first in the kingdom. And what shall we do under, under the queen Vashti according to law, because she has not performed the command of the king Ahasuerus by the chamberlains. All right, now, first of all, Vashti was foolish. Remember we read last time. When we talked about dealing with people wisely. It's foolish to to disobey a king's commandment unless it's contrary to the only one authority above him, the commandments of God. Okay. And she may have been embarrassed, but he wasn't doing this. And she also, of course, wasn't in her right mind, perhaps not thinking about the consequences, as well. But he's not entirely foolish here. He's angry, but he doesn't act on his anger immediately. Instead, he seeks counsel from other people, which we've talked about in the past. There's there's wisdom in counsel with others, with much counsel. So he does behave wisely in that way, and he asked them for their counsel, because the problem is she didn't command the command of the king by the chamberlains. Anytime you see chamberlains in here, it's referring to eunuchs. They were eunuchs. They were around they got in contact with the king's women around it. He used eunuchs so they wouldn't defile the eunuch, the women involved with the king in any shape, form, or fashion. So now he's asked for some advice, and that's actually pretty wise. And just acting off his anger immediately. Now we're going to continue on in Esther chapter 1, verse 16 through 20, and we're going to read this. Memucan answered before the king and the princes, Vashti, the queen, has not done wrong to the king only, but also to all the princes, all the people that are in the province of King Ahasuerus. For indeed the queen shall come, for this deed of the queen shall come abroad to all women. So they shall despise their husbands in their eyes when it shall be reported. The king Ahasuerus commanded Vashti the queen to be brought to before him, and she came not. Likewise, all the ladies of Persia and Media say this day unto the king's princes, which have heard of the deed of the queen. Thus there shall rise too much contempt and wrath. And if it please the king, there shall go a royal command for him, and that let be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, that it be not altered. That Vashti come no more before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal estate to another that's better than she. And when the king's decree, which he shall make, shall be published throughout all the empire, for it is great, all the wives shall give it to their husband, give to their husbands honor, both great and small. So this advice of Memucan, again, remember, we're talking about not just Esther, we're talking about the book of Esther, the various people in the book of Esther, various incidences, whether or not they're wise or not. So this guy here's advice in the context we've seen. What does he say? He says the problem is when you're in a position of leadership, more is expected of you because you'll influence other people automatically. And if the king if the king does nothing about this and lets her get away with this, first of all the wives of his 7 advisors there, and the other you might say nobles or whatever, but the other people right in the class right below the king, all the people the king actually relies on to get things done, their wives are going to do this, and it's going to cause much contempt and wrath. The wives are going to say, well, the king didn't make, king called her, and she didn't have to do what he said, and they'll get in a fight and an argument, and the husbands will get wrathful, perhaps, and it's just going to destroy the peace of the home. But it's not just the peace of their home. The word is going to get out to the entire empire. and otherwise are going to imitate Queen Vashti if we let this go. Now, remember, we talked about the wise household. The wise household values harmony, peace, and quiet above money and above almost everything, except, of course, obedience to God. Okay, so they're gonna have disruption throughout the entire, and this is gonna, the family is the building block of any society. That basic building block. It's like a set of Legos. It's each Lego. And if you let each Lego, if you took a hammer to each Lego and smashed them, broke them, it's hard to make anything. So this is very wise advice, really. I mean, what he says here is true, that he is describing the problem to a T, that if you let this get, if he lets her just get away with this, it's gonna disrupt the peace of every household in his kingdom, in his empire, and everyone, and that's going to weaken the empire internally. So now we're going to continue on here. So the king had no choice really but to put her out. He couldn't let this go. But now we're reading about the effect of the king of doing this, because so now he's sobered up, and now he's got to face the consequences. In Esther chapter 2, 1-4. After these things, the wrath of King Ahasuerus was appeased. He remembered Vashti, and she had done, and what she had done, and what was decreed against her. And the king's ministered to him, the king's servants that ministered to him, said, let fair young virgins be sought for the king. Let the kings appoint officers of all the provinces of his kingdom. They be gathered together all the fair young virgins at Shushan the palace, to the house of the women, to the custody of Hegi, the king's chamberlain, keeper of the women, and let their things of purification be given to them. And let the maid which pleased the king be queen instead of Vashti. And the thing pleased the king, and he did so. Okay, now after he sobers up, after he remembers Vashti, he's longing for Vashti. He picked her to be queen originally for a reason. I mean, something far beyond sex. He wraps other. Yeah, he probably had a harem. We know he's getting ready to make one if he didn't. And so it's not about that. Vashti was his soulmate in some regard. But now he is regretting it. And that's the thing. We do something unwise like drink alcohol. It leads to things you regret doing later. The whole thing could have been avoided if he hadn't been in that unwise situation to begin with. But now the king's mind is not going to be focused on ruling the empire, making wise decisions. So this advice his servants gives is actually wise. He's got to find another woman like Vashti that's going to be queen. Perhaps somebody he feels he can safely share his heart with. So he'll have peace of mind and can focus on ruling the empire. And of course, and the king's also pleased because he's getting ready to get a bunch of women. And notice also the advice about them being virgins, also wise. Also wise. They're not, if they just grabbed any woman, they may be careful. If they're say a prostitute, the longer they've been at, the more chance there is of carrying a venereal disease or something, right? So, beautiful young women who've not been with a man. Now we continue on in Esther chapter 2, verse 11-8, 8-11, to look at some more wise. Look at this passage to see what's wise and what's foolish in it. So it came to pass, and the king's commandment decree was heard, and when many maids were gathered together unto Shushan the palace, to the custody of Haggai, that Esther also brought into the king's house, to the custody of Haggai, keeper of the women. And the maiden pleased him, and she obtained kindness of him, and he speedily gave her things for purification, such as belonged to her, and 7 maidens, which were meet to be given her out of the king's house. And he preferred her and her maids unto the best place to the house of women. Esther had not showed her people nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged that she should not show it. Mordecai walked every day before the court of the women's house to know how Esther did and what should become of her. So the king's things carried out. But notice Esther's now entering the story here that we've been looking at so far. And Esther, notice her wisdom here. Esther goes out and befriends the keeper of the women. Remember we saw last week we talked about dealing with wise people. If you want to have friends, be friendly. Show yourself friendly. She showed herself friendly to Haggai. And Haggai, and because of this, perhaps and also you got to realize how quickly Esther adjusted to this whole situation. The king, these women, I mean, as one remake of this said, the guy comes up to show Esther, to pick up Esther, says this was not the king did not ask if you were interested, huh? These women were just sought out, and whoever decided and decided, and they maybe ask them, are they virgins or whatever, maybe some sort of inquiry, and they were just taking off whether they wanted to go or not. And perhaps some of the women took it on Haggai, but Esther showed kindness to him, and he in return showed kindness to her. So she recognizes, first of all, she's kind in general, but she recognizes the importance of being kind to the person who can help her in this situation. So Esther, now next wise thing Esther did was she did not Mordecai. Mordecai, if you've not read the story before, is the man who she was an orphan, and Mordecai is her cousin, who's quite a bit older than her, who raised her as his own daughter. And before this had happened, perhaps she was a little girl, Esther, he told Esther not to show her people or her kindred. And that was, and we'll see, the wisdom of that as we go along. But remember, one of the things we looked at is a fool says everything they know, and it's also there's a right time and a right place to say things. So this was not the right time and right place did not come to reveal this. So Mordecai had not charged her, and her wisdom was obeying Mordecai. And then of course Mordecai is showing some wisdom here because he's in Shushan. She's actually in the capital city. So it's not, so he's walking every day before the court of the women's house. So he can keep tabs on how Esther's doing. Now we continue on Esther chapter 2, verse 13 through 16, and we read this. When thus came every maiden unto the king, whatsoever she desired was given her to go with her out of the house of the women into the king's house. In the evening she went, on the morrow she returned to the second house of the women, which is the custody of Shaashgaz, the king's chamberlain, which kept the concubines. She came to the king no more, except the king delighted in her, and she was called by name. Now, when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her for his daughter, was come to go into the king, she required nothing but what Haggai, the king's chamberlain, the keeper of the women, appointed. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all them that looked upon her. And Esther was taken into the king Ahasuerus in his house royal, into his house royal in the 10th month, which was the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. So now So notice that these women can take whatever they want with them, and where they're in the house, the keeper of the virgins, and they're going to go into the king, and then they're going to be transferred to the king, the concubines. And the concubines, by the way, in case you don't know, generally a concubine is a concubine. When a man takes a concubine, is a wife, but he's only concerned with her and her children, not her extended family. And often they were orphans and things like that who had no extended family, or slaves and the like. And it was an improvement. But a wife was someone who's concerned more about more than just his own, not just her own children, the king, her husband, and her own children, and that's it. She's concerned about his extended family as well, and he is hers. The difference between a wife with a concubine is just the joining together of the lives of two people. With a wife, it's the joining together of the lives is joining together two families through these people. So, just explain why what this concubine business is. So she went in. So she goes in there. So, but they can keep whatever they bring with them. Now, who knows what the other women brought? What desire? They're going to get to keep it for life. And perhaps they went off to, the first one probably got to pick first, and she got the most expensive jewels and stuff she could find. Okay. Except it was all about what, for everyone else except Esther, it was all about what pleased them. But notice Esther isn't concerned all about what pleases her. He asked Haggai, who she's befriended, what does the king like? She was living to please the king. So when she goes in there, and Haggai knows the king and knows what he likes, and she just takes her whatever he tells her and nothing else. So when now he goes in there, she's already set up in a good position. She is already wearing whatever pleases the king. So she's already given herself an edge in this competition in that regard. But her whole mindset was different. She was living to please the king. Now we continue on Esther 17 through chapter 2, verse 17 through 19. We read this. And the king loved Esther above all the women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins. So he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king made a great feast of all his princes and servants, even Esther's feast. He made a release of the provinces and gave gifts according to the state of the king. And the virgins were gathered together the second time. Then Mordecai sat in the king's gate. Okay. Because she was focused on pleasing the king was pleased with her. So he picks her to be queen. So she was wise. Now his reason for picking her perhaps wasn't necessarily wise. It's just about whoever pleases me the most. I mean, there's a little wisdom in that. He don't want someone to be queen he can't get along with, but or somebody has a code relationship with. But now the next thing the king does is actually very wise. He creates this great feast, and he starts off in his palace, but he extends it to all the provinces. And this release it means they didn't have to pay taxes that year. That wasn't like America, where people take some money out of your paycheck every paycheck, and then at the end, if you pay too much, you get a rebate, or if you didn't, you have to pay some more, whatever. In April, no, it was incumbent upon them to save that money up. Often it was just so much per person of a certain class, regardless of the circumstances. So releasing them was just like giving them let's say they made the equivalent of American $100,000, and they had to pay $10,000 in tax. It's like giving him $10,000 because of Queen Esther. They're going to remember now Esther's the queen. They're going to remember. He also gives them gifts besides that. They're going to, and this king is that king in Daniel, so it's far richer than all the others. This guy is just ridiculously rich, okay? But he's making sure his happiness is the happiness of his entire kingdom. And also, so everyone knows, get people's mind off Vashti being queen, who was queen, establish that Esther's the queen now. And everyone's going to remember it because of his actions. And the last thing is, when these virgins are gathered the second time, they're taking not virgins, they're concubines at this point. And Solomon, that Mordecai is in the king's gate. He's still hanging out close to Esther, watching out for her. Now we're going to continue on in Esther chapter 2 and verses 20 through 23, where we read this. Esther had not yet showed her kindred or her people as Mordecai had charged her. For Esther did the commandment of Mordecai like when she was brought up to him with him. In those days, Mordecai sat in the king's gate. Well, Mordecai sat in the king's gate. Two of the king's chamberlains, Bigtosh and Teresh, of those which kept the door, was wroth and sought to lay hands on the king Ahasuerus. And the thing was known to Mordecai, who told it to Esther the queen, and Esther certified the king, therefore, in Mordecai's name. And when the inquisition was made of the matter, it was found out, therefore, they were both hanged on a tree, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles before the king. Okay, so the first wise thing here is Esther. She's still not revealing that she's a Jew. And why? Because she's still obeying the commandment of Mordecai. Now you might say, wait a minute. Esther's now married to the king. Mordecai's a gatekeeper. She's the queen. She's way above him. In social status, etc. But she is still obeying him. Yes, because it's another lesson. But the Bible makes it really plain when you look at it. That honor and obey for the parents does not end completely with marriage. Yes, you're to seek to please your spouse above your parents, but your parents still have some authority over you. Remember, Mordecai's the one that raised her. And she is wise to keep listening to keep obeying him, even though she's got much greater social status, etc. She kept herself humble, didn't let it go to her head, and just kept doing what Mordecai told her to do. Now, the next thing here is Mordecai learns of this plot, and I think we looked at this before, but the Bible says if you know there's evil about and you do nothing about it, it's not wise, right? That's what it says. In fact, it says in the Torah in Leviticus 5:1. I'm paraphrasing here, but basically it says, if you know something wicked, you don't tell the authorities, you're guilty with those who did it. Okay. So Mordecai is wise to tell the king. And notice there's some wisdom here in the thing. They didn't just take Mordecai's word for it. He informed them. They investigated and made sure it was true. They perhaps had found some other witnesses, etc. Whatever it was, they investigated it and found it was true. And now the last wise thing is they hung these two guys. They didn't just execute them; they hung them on a tree so everyone could see them. And who knows how long they left them on the tree? They may have left them overnight. They may have left them there for a month. Who knows? But the reason is important because you can't have a stable, peaceful kingdom or empire with rebels in it who want to destroy the king. They had not actually harmed the king, but the intent was enough. So they got rid of the rebels out of the kingdom. Now we go to Esther chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. And we're gonna be introduced to our villain in this story, Haman, or Haman, which we prefer. After these things, the king Ahasuerus promote Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, advanced him and set his seat above all the princes that were with him. And all the king's servants that were in the king's gate bowed in reverence to Haman. For the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai bowed not, neither did him reverence. When the king's servants who were in the king's gate said to Mordecai, Why you transgress thou the king's commandment? Now it came to pass when they spoke daily, and he hearkened not unto them, that they told Haman to see where King Mordecai's mares would stand. For he had told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw Mordecai bow not, nor did him reverence, it was full of Haman's wrath. He sought scorn to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they'd shown him the people of Mordecai. Therefore, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews that were brought out throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, even the people of Mordecai. All right, now we don't know why Ahasuerus promoted Haman, but it's probably safe to say Haman had given some wise advice. He had showed him, or at least the king believed he was wise in some way above the others. Now, the king gives his commandment concerning Haman. Everyone's to bow to him as if he was the king, and Mordecai won't do it. Well, remember, we said it's wise to obey the commandments of the king, except when they're contrary to the commandments of God. And why Mordecai decides why Mordecai, because people ask him about this, and he has to tell him he's a Jew. That ties into why he won't bow. It's not he won't bow to the king, but this guy here is a descendant of Agag. And Agagite means descendant of Agag. Agag was the king of the Amalekites when Israel was in the wilderness, and they attacked the children. They attacked the rear of the camp where the old people and the children were. I think very cowardly of them. And God said he'd always be at war with Amalek. And Agag was particularly cursed. Okay. Because basically he had lined himself up with Satan here, So bowing to Agag for Mordecai, someone that God had cursed, would be like bowing to Satan. So Mordecai was wise not to bow to him and to break the king's commandment in this case, because there's a higher commandment he needs to obey. Now we'll flip it over to Haman. Haman is, he's not wise at all. He's full of wrath. And why does he think of his wrath? Mordecai is one man out of how many or thousands or hundreds of thousands of Jews there were, in the Persian Empire. But he's going to destroy them all. He's out to get all the Jews throughout the entire empire, because he's mad at one man. This same man who's let his anger cloud his judgment. And he's acting like his ancestor, okay? Now we continue on in Esther chapter 3. We continue on verses 7 through 11. In the first month, that is the month of Nisan, the 12th month of King Ahasuerus, they cast pur, that is the lot, before Haman from day to day, from month to month, to the 12th month, that is the month of Adar. And Haman said unto King Ahasuerus, there's a certain people scattered abroad, dispersed among the people, all the provinces of your kingdom. The laws are diverse from all people. They're keeping the king's law. Therefore, it is not the king's profit to suffer them. If it be pleased, let it be written that they may be destroyed. I'll pay 10,000 talents of silver to the hands of those that keep charge of the business to bring it into the king's treasuries. And the king took his ring from his hand, gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the Jews' enemy. And the king said unto Haman, the silver is given you, the people also to do with them as it seems good to you. Well, there's a number of things here. Now, first of all, I'm going to explain this. Why does it say the first month to tell you the name of the month? Because in the biblical calendar, when the biblical calendar was originally given, the only month that had a name was Aviv, the first month. Okay, it's based on from new moon to new moon. So now we're now at the 12th year and 5 years have passed. And the month of so now but these Nisan and Adar are Babylonian names for those months. So but originally they were just only the first one had a name, Aviv. The rest were month 1, month 2. I mean, other than that, generally they were month 1, month 2, month 3, like that. It was just a number. So it's to give you an idea of, to correlate them, if you will, to the biblical calendar, which I talked about in length before and showed the entire biblical timekeeping system. Now it's tied to the land of Israel and the climate there and everything else. So he's casting lots, and the significance of that is, remember, the lots resolve contention, but the Lord controls the lots. And notice this lots are cast in the first month, and now there's 11 months off. God favored him, gave 11 months time delay. The maximum he could have given when they're casting lots for months 1 through 12. Okay. Now Haman, look at Haman's accusation. And the truth is, most of it has a lot of truth to it. These certain people, the Jews, were scattered dispersed among the people in all the provinces of his kingdom. Absolutely true. When God said to Israel, if you don't keep my statutes, commandments, I will scatter you to the ends of the earth, he was not kidding. I mean, in the Roman dispersion, literally went to the ends of the earth. I met a guy who was from Rapha and Edom. It's the furthest point habitable place on earth from Jerusalem, and his house was on this peninsula towards the end of it, that was to the southeast. Yeah, southeast. I mean, I actually looked at a satellite photo of it. Google Maps it and looked and confirmed it. His house was literally the furthest point on earth from Jerusalem, and he was a Jew. He was this Jewish guy I met in a church a long time ago. So God wasn't so he scattered them across all these provinces. That's true. The laws are diverse. Yes, the laws in the Torah are different from all other people. They're meant to be different. Okay. So now this part's not entirely true. Neither keep they the king's laws. Well, that's true when the king's law contradicts these laws that God gave Moses. And in particular, he was thinking of Haman. I mean, he was thinking of Mordecai. And it was, it's true that Mordecai didn't keep the king's law. But they don't keep it wasn't all the king's laws, just those that contradicted the law that God gave Moses. Otherwise, the law says to keep the king's law. Now, this last part's not true. This is where Haman twists the whole thing. It's not your profit to suffer them. No proof. Now, the next thing. So he tells the king what to do about it. Notice he offers him a bribe. Now the king is super rich, doesn't need this money. His 10,000 talents of silver is nothing to him, really. But remember, that's not wise of the king to accept it. The king accepted it, and the king accepted this bribe to be brought this treasure. And remember, a bribe perverts judgment. We talked about the wise ruler. The wise ruler does not accept bribes, but King Ahasuerus did, even though the bribe, he was flattered. He was flattered by the bribe. It wasn't really about the value of the bribe. And notice the next thing that unwise King Ahasuerus does in this part. He just doesn't even check out Haman's story. There's no investigation like we saw with Bigthan and Teresh earlier. He's like, oh, okay, in that case, take care of this. Because the bride perverted his judgment. Normally, you see this, there's some sort of investigation, but not this time. And the Bible tells us, again, we looked at this, and we've been reading the writings of Solomon mostly. Everyone's story sounds right. You hear the other person's and start investigating. And the wise thing to do is investigate. Don't believe every spirit. Test everything. Test it against Scripture. In the example I just gave, but test everything. The Bible tells us to be skeptical. It doesn't tell us to be unbelieving. That's a stubborn refusal to believe. But it does tell us to be skeptical, not taking those words for it. And and the king here did not do that. Okay, he just took Haman's word for it, with no investigation. Now we continue on in Esther chapter 3, verses 12 through 15, and we're gonna look at the next Haman's plan here, his execution of his plan to solve this. Well, he's told the king's a problem. Then the king's scribes called the 13th day of the first month. It was written according to all Haman had commanded the king's lieutenant to the governors that were over every province, and to the rulers of every province, according to the writing thereof, and to the people of their language, in the name of the king Ahasuerus is written, still with the king's ring. And the letters were sent by post unto all the king's province, to destroy, to kill, and to cause to perish all Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day, even upon the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to take the spoil of them for a prey. The copy of the writing commanded given to every province was published unto all people. They should be ready against that day. And the post went out, being hasty the king's commandment. The decree was given in Shushan, the palace, and the king of Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Shushan was perplexed. Okay, there's a lot to notice in there. Notice the 13th day of the first month is what? The day before Passover. Okay. And Passover is what? About being passed over into deliverance from Egypt. All right, delivered from another king that meant to enslave the Jewish people and had not done them well. Right. So, and notice when the lot fell, 11 months exactly later. So there's 11 months here. So now he's taking advantage of this 11-month gap for what to be able to prepare, and he's really very wise in how he wants to carry out his evil plan. And I want you to notice among the Jews, the same group that the Amalekites attacked, the young and the old, the little children and the women, the ones that were in the rear. He is doing the same thing his ancestor Agag led the Amalekites to do. And notice, to take a spoil of the prey. Now he's given the people across the Persian Empire incentive. If you kill the Jews, you get to keep their stuff. Now, I mean, particularly if you have some poor guy living near a Jew that's rich. I mean, but that's quite incentive. And Hitler did the same thing. People turned to their Jewish neighbors, got their house and everything in it, and as a result, a lot of people turned to their Jewish neighbors. So, as far as actually getting people to do what he wants, this is actually very wise. His desire to do it in the first place is foolish, but his plan to carry it out is actually pretty wise. And he's making sure everyone can be ready against that day, so that they're all prepared. 11 months to prepare. And they're motivated by greed. He offers them the motivation of greed for doing this. And the city of Shushan's perplexed because in Jeremiah, it's in Jeremiah, I believe it's Jeremiah. It says the commandment of God is I'm gonna scare is Jeremiah. I'm gonna scare you. I'm gonna scare you. That's it. Judgment's coming. You're gonna be scared, just like I told you I would in the law that God they gave Moses. If you continue to keep disobeying my commandments, but to make it easier on yourself, here's what you want to do. Everywhere you go, seek the good of the place that you're scattered to, and it's good because its prosperity is your prosperity. And Jews have done this historically ever since then. Out in Tulsa, where I live, there's a number of things for the public where they've helped the city beautify the city, built up things of value like a place to provide physical therapy for poor people who are elderly or perhaps have some sort of issues for free, and all kinds of things. And it's all over the U.S. And everywhere else they've been, you can see things with names of Jewish families on it for public good, or to beautify. Perhaps they build a park. I mean, even the American Revolution, one of the problems Washington had, we didn't have a way to pay his soldiers, and two Jewish men, the Getz brothers, who were merchants, loaned Congress the money to pay them, so they wouldn't. So in Valley Forge they wouldn't leave. And there's another guy did something similar. And Congress, being Congress, actually never repaid them, but they sought the good of the places of the place where they were at. Okay, and this is why Shushan's perplexed. They've done us nothing but good. Now the king's issued an edict, wipe them out. It made no sense to people of Shushan. We continue on in Esther chapter 4, verses 1 through 6. When Mordecai perceived all that was done, Mordecai rent his clothes and put on sackcloth with ashes, and went out in the midst of the city and cried with a loud and bitter cry, and came before the king's gate, for none might enter the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. In every province, whithersoever the king's command and decree came, there was great mourning among the Jews, fasting and weeping and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. So Esther's maids and their chamberlains came and told it her. And then was the queen exceedingly grieved, and she sent raiment to Mordecai to take away sackcloth from him, but they received it not. Then called Esther to Hatak, one of the king's chamberlains, whom he had appointed to attend upon her, and gave her a commandment to Mordecai, know what it was and why it was. So Hatak went forth to Mordecai in the street, which is before the king's gate. Okay, first of all, let's talk about Mordecai. Now, the name of God is never mentioned openly in the book of Esther. However, there's 7 turning points. They do spell out Jehovah. That may perhaps give us a clue which vowels belong, because it's got the tetragrammaton, but it's also got vowels in between. The turning points. Anyways, so it is in there hidden, and his hidden hands there revealed to everyone to look to see, who can see, who has eyes to see. So what Mordecai is doing here is very wise. There's no one in the kingdom higher than the king, and not even the king can change his own command. But there is one higher than the king, and that's God Almighty. And so Mordecai is going to get wisdom. That's what him and the Jews are doing. And the sackcloth and ashes shows distress. Also is about repentance. Perhaps some of them need to repent of things as well. So now they're in repentance and mourning, and getting God involved in their problem. Very exceedingly wise. And that's why he wouldn't take the clothes. But now the queen doesn't know what's going on here, Esther. But she doesn't just blow him off wherever. She sends someone to investigate, which was also wise for her to do. As we continue on Esther chapter 4, we go to verses 7 and 11. We read the following. And Mordecai told him all that happened unto him, to the sum of the money that Haman had promised to pay to the king's treasuries for the Jews to destroy them. They gave him the copy of the writing decree, which is given at Shushan, to destroy them. to show it unto Esther and declare it to her, to charge her that she would go into the king and make supplication to him and make a request before him for her people. And Hatak came and told Esther the words of Mordecai. Again Esther spoke unto Hatak and gave him the commandment of Mordecai. All the king's servants and provinces do know that whosoever, whether man or woman, shall come into the king in the inner court, who is not called, there's one law of his, to put him to death, except such to whom the king holds out the golden scepter, they may live. But I have been called to come in to the king but I have not been called to come into the king these 30 days. Remember, we saw earlier when the king during the contest, when the king wanted one of his wives, when one of his wives for sex at night, they were brought to her. They were brought to his palace, his thing. They were brought to his chamber, and he's not been called in 30 days. It's been 5 years. Perhaps, the enemy has planted this thought in her. Honeymoon's over. You're just not that important to him or whatever, He said he likes one of the other women better. Who knows what thoughts the enemy put in their head, right? But Mordecai has been praying, and now he has a wise. He tells him he gives a message, a wise message for the king to do. The only one who in the Persian Empire who can do anything about this is her husband, the king, the emperor of the Persian Empire. The guy under him is Haman. He's the one who did this in the first place. Everyone below Haman can't override Haman in any way. And so he tells her to make a request. But Esther realizes the problem is Esther realizes is to do so. The king, he can make this king has a temper, and if he decides, unless he decides to hold that golden scepter out to her, she's dead for trying to come in and do it. So she's wise. She's wise in that she recognizes the danger or the risk in going. But now let's look and see how this continue on and see how this plays out. We're continuing on Esther chapter 4 and verses 12 through 16. And they told Mordecai Esther's words. Then Mordecai commanded to Esther, think not that you yourself shall escape in the king's house any more than all the Jews. For if you altogether hold your peace at this time, there shall be an enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house shall be destroyed. Who knows where you are coming to the kingdom for such a time as this? Then Esther bade them return to Mordecai this answer. Go gather all the Jews that are present in Shushan. Fast you for me, neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. I also, my maids, will fast likewise. So I will go into the king, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish. Now, so the two most famous phrases from Esther are right there in a little 3-verse passage. Such a time as this, and if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai, Esther's raised her wise concern, and Mordecai gives her some more wisdom here. She's a Jew also. Her being queen does not make her immune to this. As a matter of fact, there's undoubtedly 127 women. There's 127 provinces. We'll see later. You can be at least 127 women. One of them would want to be queen and was certain to turn her in, or kill him herself. They could, or whatever, plot a hatch for her. She's going to die if she does nothing. Okay, it's not really a question of is she going to die. There is no not going to die option here, except to go to the king and he hold out a scepter to her. If she does nothing, she's going to die as well. And so it's not wise for her to do nothing. But also Mordecai, remember he's seeking God. No, he believes the word of God that deliverance will arise, but it's not going to arise for her and her father's house. And he recognized the hand of God, just like Joseph. His brothers sold him into slavery. He ended up in prison ultimately. And then Pharaoh brought him up. And when his brothers came to him, he said, what you meant for evil, God meant for good, for the saving of many people. In the same way, he recognized the hand of God in this. So now Esther's wise answer. First of all, notice she doesn't rush into the. She understands. She says, okay, I need to go in there. She doesn't rush right in there. What does she do instead? Fasting. Going to get God. Now she's seeking not the king of Persia, her husband, the king of the universe's favor. She's going to get him involved first. And she's just going to go ahead and take the risk, because at the end of the day, it's no risk for her. She's going to die one way or the other. But she's going to go in there armed. She's going to go in there armed with wisdom. She's going to seek God for wisdom and going to seek God for favor. Now we continue on Esther 5, verses 1 through 5. We read this. Now it came to pass on the third day that Esther put on her royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's house. Over against the king's house, the king sat upon his royal throne in the royal house over against the gate of the house. And so it was when the king saw Esther the queen stand in the court, that she obtained favor in his sight, and the king held out the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther drew near and touched the top of the scepter. Then the king said to her, What will you, Queen Esther? What is your request? Shall be given to you even half of the kingdom. Esther answered, If it seem good to the king, let the king and Haman come this day to the banquet I prepared for him. And when the king said, cause Haman to make haste to do that, may do as Esther has said. So the king and Haman came to the banquet that Esther prepared. Okay, Esther has gotten the wisdom now. She goes in, and the king indeed has favor with her. He knows she's not another Vashti. He knows, he's wise to discern she's risking her life for a reason. He wants to know what it is, to be honest. So he tells him he's going to give her the request. Again, he doesn't know what the request is. That wasn't necessarily wise of him, but nonetheless he did it. And the request is, no, she's already prepared the banquet. She's already acted. And because it's already prepared, she won't say them to come in. They come in for the banquet. Just the king and Haman, by the way, and the attending people, of course, but just them too. And she's already got prepared. And because already prepared, Haman can come right away. And this is very wise, because now the king's going to know where Haman is. Is going to know where Haman is. Haman's going to be right there with them, so the king can take action to deliver Esther. We continue on Esther chapter 5, verses 6 through 10, and read the following. And the king said to Esther, the queen of the banquet of wine, What is your petition? It shall be granted to you. What is your request? Even the half the kingdom, it shall be reformed. Then answered Esther and said, My petition request is, if I found favor in the sight of the king, and please the king to grant my petition, reform my request, let the king and Haman come to the banquet that I shall prepare for them, and I will do tomorrow as the king has said. Then went Haman forth that day joyful, with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, he stood up. They stood not up, nor moved for him. He was full of indignation against Mordecai. Nonetheless, Haman refrained himself. When he came home, he sent and called for his friends and Zeresh's wife. All right, first thing I want you to notice that's wise is the banquet of wine. She knows the king likes his wine. It also makes it a little more pliable. And now, the next wise thing she does, she still doesn't tell the king what she really wants. She tells the king, I'll tell you tomorrow, and make another banquet. and tell you tomorrow. Now, why is that wise? Because Esther now has a day there. She's already at the king's house. She now has a night to be with the king in his chamber, to do whatever's pleasing to him, to get him even more inclined to give her her request. She is what in America we would say is, in the say when I grew up, buttering him up. Okay, before just telling him what she wants, she's getting him in a good mood first. She's giving the king his favorite foods, his favorite drinks, favorite activities. Whatever it is, the king wants that puts him in a good mood, she's doing it. And she's also having the Haman there is also wise for another reason, because it's kind of setting up Haman as well, because as we shall see. Now, Haman, let's flip to him, and what he does is he can't just be happy. I mean, he's not wise there at all. He's letting this thing. He's letting this thing get. As soon as he sees Mordecai, his happiness is all gone. But what he does, but nonetheless, he has some wisdom. He refrains himself. Remember, don't just to act on your wisdom, on your anger quickly. And he gets some counsel. He calls his wife, his friends, and Zeresh, his wife, for some counsel. So Haman shows some wisdom, but he just can't let this thing go. He's envious or bitter about Mordecai. He's bitter about it, and that's like rottenness to the bone, we're told, or like having bone cancer. Just won't leave him. Okay. Let's continue on Esther chapter 5, verses 11 through 14, and we read the next thing Haman does. Now, Haman told them of the glory of his rich, the multitude of his children, all the things that were in the king had promoted him, and how he advanced him above the princes and the servants of the king. Haman said, moreover, yea, Esther the queen did not let no man come to the king, unto the king of the banquet she prepared, but myself. And tomorrow I was invited also. Tomorrow am I also invited unto her with the king. It doesn't avails me nothing as long as Mordecai the Jew. I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. And when Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends with him, said to him, let gallows at 50 cubits high be made 50 cubits high. Tomorrow speak you unto the king that Mordecai be hanged thereon. Then you shall go merrily with the king to the banquet. And the thing pleased Mordecai, and he caused the gallows to be made. So, first thing Mordecai does is brag. Pride comes before a fall. And the multitude of his children probably indicates he has more than one. He perhaps also has a bunch of concubines, and Zeresh is the only one that's his wife, okay? But he's bragging about how rich he is, and how many children he's fathered, And he's bragging about his power, about his political power. So that's not wise at all. And his bragging, his pride is keeping him from seeing this whole thing's a trap for him. I mean, he thinks Esther has him in there because he is so special. He is the second greatest man in the kingdom. He is right below the king. And he thinks that's why Esther has brought him in there. But he just can't be happy. The next unwise thing he does. Even with all this stuff he's bragging about, how good life is. This one thing just won't leave him alone. It's like a cancer in his bones that he can't get rid of. So his wife and his friends give him some advice that's got a little bit of wisdom to it, really, on the surface at least. Okay, if you go to the king and have the king hang Mordecai, then you don't have to worry about seeing Mordecai at the gate anymore. and they'll be out of your mind, and you can just go in there and be happy. Again, it seems like a sensible plan at the in the context of what he's told them. They don't know the whole story, perhaps, but he does. And Haman's all happy with this, and he has it caused to be done. And we'll see. We shall see that this turned out to be foolish, him going along with this, even though it did solve his immediate. It did solve what was bugging him immediate. What was bugging him right then. It's not going to turn out well for him. We continue on in Esther chapter 6, verses 6 through 9. We read this. So Haman came in, and the king said to him, "What should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor?" Now Haman thought in his heart, "Whom would the king delight to honor more than to myself?" And Haman answered the king, For the man whom the king delights to honor, let royal apparel be brought, which the king uses to wear. The king and the horse that the king rides upon, and the royal crown which is set upon his head. Let this apparel and horse be delivered into the hand of one of the king's most noble princes. They may array the man withal whom the king delights to honor, and bring him on horseback to the street of the city, and proclaim before him, thus shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Okay, now the part I didn't show right there, the king couldn't sleep and learn that Mordecai had saved him, but had never been paid, and Mordecai had been wise to not seek promotion, as I said before. It says something similar to what Yeshua says in Proverbs. We looked at before. It's better for you to be at a banquet, to be sitting down at the lower part and called up, than go up to the upper part and be called down. So Mordecai has waited about 5 years here, never said anything, waiting for God to pick the time for him to be repaid, instead of trying to seek immediate repayment himself. He didn't even seek credit. It was written down, but he didn't seek it. And so now the king's talking about him, but of course, Haman, foolish Haman, thinks this is about him. His pride has blinded him. He doesn't even notice, again, he doesn't do this wise thing. He doesn't investigate. He didn't even ask, say, who is this man you're talking about? He assumes it's himself, makes an assumption. And based on that assumption, he gives what could arguably be a wise way to handle things. Depends on the person you're honoring. I'll explain that in a minute. But notice this parallel here is similar to what was happening to the saints, to the believers, when Yeshua returns to the earth. He's coming in a white robe, so are they. He's coming in a white hearse, so are they. He's wearing a crown, so are they. Okay. So the servant is going to be made to look like the king, and everyone's going to be told about this and to know this. That's all good, unless this guy the king's honoring has nefarious purposes. Because Haman, not saying he did, but I'm saying he could have had this in his mind. The plant in the people in the mind of Persia that he's equal with the king. Haman may have been people just never happy. I mean, he wasn't happy with all that stuff he had as long as Mordecai was there. Maybe he wasn't really happy being number 2 under the king. Maybe he really thought number 2 is good, but number 1 would be so much better. Again, I'm not saying he thought that, but I'm saying it's certainly possible. And if that was his thought process, and the same advice would be wise for someone with the right heart, like Mordecai, would be bad advice, would be foolish to do for someone with a wicked heart, like Haman. Now, we're going to continue on in Esther chapter 6 and verses 10 through 14. Then the king said to Haman, "Make haste and take the apparel on the horse, as you have said, and do so to Mordecai, the Jew, sitting on the king's gate. Let nothing fall of all that you have spoken." Then took Haman the apparel on the horse, and arrayed Mordecai, and brought him on the horseback to the street of the city, and proclaimed before him, "Thus it shall be done to the king, unto the man whom the king delights to honor." And Mordecai came to the king's gate. again to the king's gate. But Haman hastened to his house mourning and having his head covered. Haman told Zeresh's wife and all his friends everything that had befallen him. And then said his wise men and Zeresh's wife unto him, if Mordecai be the seed of the Jews, before he be begun to fall, you shall not prevail against him, but you shall surely fall before him. And while they were yet talking, came the king's chamberlain, hastened to bring Mordecai to the banquet that Esther had prepared. Okay. So Mordecai to carry us out. And then, but let's look at this. The wisdom here of Mordecai after it's done. He goes back to the king's gate. He doesn't run off and tell everyone and brag on what just happened. They've all seen it. But he doesn't brag. He didn't go get his friends and say, oh man, did you see me? I was, the king put his crown on me. He doesn't do all this. He goes back to the king's gate because remember he's at the king's gate so he can keep an eye. He's looking out for Esther's safety, remember? And it's his job. He just goes back to work. But Haman, he's in mourning now. He has his head covered. I don't want anyone to see him because he's ashamed. His foolish actions have brought shame to him, as we read what happened. Foolishness brings shame, right? Now, when he tells his wife, he gets some counsel this time. They give him some advice. They give him some counsel that's right. It's wise, but it's not what he wanted to hear. If Mordecai's the seed of the Jews, and he began to fall before he was surely going to fall. Why do they say that? Because they've observed. If they didn't know any scripture, they observed by through observation. They realize God curses those that curse those. If history only had one lesson, to be this: don't screw with the Jews, and they recognize it. Those who curse the Jews end up cursed. Those who bless the Jews end up blessed, which is why his advice to the king to get rid of these people, and become their enemy, was so foolish advice. Okay, but they recognize it. And now Esther has been wise in being preparing. Now, remember, like Solomon, we've been studying his words. The problem is, you read Solomon's life, he didn't always apply his own wisdom. Okay. It's one thing to know what's wise to do. It's another to actually do it and follow through. And Esther's done that. That action was wise because now Mordecai, his wife just told him, you're going to fall for the Jews. And he has no chance to escape because the banquet's already ready. And Mordecai's whisked away to it. Now we continue on in Esther chapter 7, verses 1 through 5. In our story, we read this. So the king and Haman came to the banquet with Esther the queen. Then the king said to Esther on the second day at the banquet of wine, what is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. What is your request to be formed even to the half of the kingdom? Then Esther the queen answered and said, if I found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we are sold, I and my wife, to be destroyed, to be slain, to perish. But if we have been sold, if we've been sold for bondmen and bondwomen, I'd have held my tongue. All the enemy cannot countervail the king's damage. And then the king Ahasuerus answered, said to Esther the queen, who is he? Where is he? That does presume in his heart to do so. Okay, now countervail means they couldn't undo the king's damage. Okay, the king, they can't undo the king's damage because the king, once he signs that with his ring, none of the king can change the law. Okay, so if they had just been being sold into slavery, she would have said nothing. She would have taken this bold action, but it was just her life for the lives of these others. But notice she's burned the king up again. Banquet of wine. Got him in a good mood. The first banquet of wine. Implied she spent the night with him. Got him in a better mood. Got him and kept the good mood going with another banquet of wine. Now he's all buttered up, as they'd say where I grew up. She lets the king know what she really wants. And by the way, a little tip there for husbands and wives. The wise woman doesn't just jump in and do things. Sometimes, particularly if she needs something from her husband that's difficult, or perhaps a little perhaps difficult, like in this case, telling her that about Haman here, how to deal with him. She butters him up first. The wise husband lets being buttered up work most of the time. If he wants to get the treatment more than once. But I say most of the time, because if his wife's buttering up to do something foolish, he cannot do it. Or she's doing this, or is she just he can't let himself become a puppet to her. But nonetheless, if he wants this to continue to occur again, he needs to think carefully about whether or not to tell her no or not. Okay. So this king's very inclined, and now the king's even grown fonder of Esther. And now she has done nothing but good for him for 2 days, and now he is beside himself. He wants to know who's doing this. In Esther chapter 7, verse 6 through 10, we'll continue on our story here. And Esther said, the adversary of the enemy is this wicked Haman. And then Haman was afraid before the king and the queen. And the king, rising from the banquet of wine in his wrath, went to the palace garden. And Haman stood to make a request for his life to Esther the queen, for he saw there was evil determined against him by the king. And when the king returned out of the palace garden into the place of the banquet of the wine, Haman was fallen upon the bed whereon Esther was. Then the king said, will he force the queen before me in the house? As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. And Urbona, one of the chamberlains, said before the king, behold, the gallows 50 feet high, which Haman had made for Mordecai, who spoke good for the king, stand in the house of Haman. Then the king said, hang him thereon. So they hanged Haman on the gallows they prepared for Mordecai, and the king's wrath was pacified. All right, first of all, we'll start with Esther. Now she has picked the right time to release some information. She's letting them know that Haman's this one. Well, was Haman? Remember, she said her life was threatened. Everything. Why? Who? Haman's decree. She's now letting out that she's a Jew. She picked again. A fool tells everything they know. But the wise person waits for the right time, the right place, the right circumstances. And Esther's got all those going. And Haman has no means to escape. He's right there with the king. And the king's guards are not going to just let him leave. Now, notice the king also is being wise at this point. The king, even though he's burning with anger, at this time, he does not do what he did at the beginning, just immediately act on his anger. He goes out into the garden. He's giving himself a chance to cool down so he can make wise judgment. But he's still mad, and he's still mad. And notice that Haman starts out wise, but then does something foolish. It was wise for him to make a request of Esther for his life. She may have had mercy on him because those that have mercy on others will have mercy themselves. But even the Torah makes this plain. He was wise and he could see there was evil turned against him by the king. That was wise of him. Queen Esther was the only one that could have saved him. What he didn't do was wise. He fell on her bed. And when the king came in, his anger is back. Immediately it looks like to him, Haman's trying to rape his queen right there in his own house. And as we talked about wisdom with women. If a man who's married and he values his wife, if another man commits adultery with her, no amount of money can appease him. He wants that man's blood. and he's the king, and no one can keep him from taking this man's blood. And Habarna is also wise here. He don't want to be around the king. He's around this king all the time. He don't want to be around him if he's going around mad all the time. He wants to anger the king to get back in a good mood as quick as possible. When the king's in a good mood, he's more generous, more forgiving of little mistakes. You don't want him being mad all the time. That can cause all kinds of problems, not just for the empire, but for his servants in particular. And he tells her mom, so he gives us wise advice how to get rid of this anger. You want his blood because he threatened the life of your queen, and because it looked like he's trying to rape her. Just kill him. Get rid of him on the same gallows that he prepared for Mordecai. And remember, he says that Mordecai had done him good. So now Haman, the king, can see that Haman is trying to pay evil to someone that done the king good, and that's all the more motivation. And it worked. The king's wrath was pacified. But that's not the end of the story, because they still have a problem, as we're going to see here as we continue on Esther chapter 8 and verses 3 through 7. And Esther yet spake again before the king, and fell down at his feet, and besought him with tears to put away the mischief of Haman the Agagite, his device that he prepared against the Jews. Then the king held out the golden sword, the scepter, towards Esther. So Esther arose and stood before the king. And if it pleased the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and the thing seemed right before the king, and I be pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to reverse the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, which he wrote to destroy the Jews that are in the king's provinces. How can I endure to see the evil that shall come upon my people? How can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred? Then the king said to Esther the queen and Mordecai the Jew, behold, I've given Esther the house of Haman, and him that they hanged upon the gallows because they had laid his hands upon the Jews. Oh yeah, one last thing I want to mention here: the wisdom of hiding, of covering the face, Haman's face. They put a hood over him, because the king, a king can have his judgment perverted, or his judgment can be influenced by people's emotions. Haman may have been pleading with him, been his friend for a while, and it may have softened him, or Haman could have had an angry look or whatever and hardened him. He couldn't judge fairly. So get that emotion out of the picture. Because remember what we talked about before, we talked about in the previous lessons, that when the Bible says thinking soberly, it's talking about this way, considering only the facts, the evidence, and the circumstances. Okay, emotions pushed out. You're not to consider emotion at all. That will cause you to think drunkenly. And an example, of course, would be a young man with a maid. He's not thinking straight because his emotions are all not just his hormones, but his emotions are all swirling around. Okay, so that's why they did that. Now, this part here, we see this problem here. I'm gonna read it again. And Esther again spoke yet before the king, and fell at his feet, and besought him with tears, put away the mischief of Agag, the Haman the Agagite, and his device he had devised against the Jews. The king held the golden scepter towards Esther. So Esther rose and stood before the king, and it pleased the king, if I have found favor in his sight, and the thing right before the king, I be pleasing in his eyes. Let it be written to reverse the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote to destroy the Jews which are in the king's provinces. For how shall I endure to see the evil that shall come upon my people? How shall I endure to see the destruction of my kindred? Then the king Ahasuerus said unto Esther the queen, to Mordecai the Jew, Lord, I've given Esther the house of Haman, him that hanged him on the gallows, because he laid his hands upon the Jews. Okay, so beginning at now notice she now this held out the scepter. So this is not in the banquet room where they were. This is not this is not in their bedchamber. He's back in there where he's doing his job as king, in the throne room.
And she goes in. And she has total confidence this time. He holds it out. He's made it plain that she can come in anytime he wants, anytime she wants. So now she says she tells him about this problem. The king, remember, not even the king can get rid of it, can reverse a law he's made. And that law is going to cause her to be killed. And her people. And her family. And her family includes Mordecai the Jew. And the king. I mean, so she's laying the problem out to the king very plainly, and she's making it plain she's a Jew, just in case he didn't catch on before. Okay, and that's something else. Why she didn't assume he put 2 and 2 together, because people don't always. She gives him the answer of 4 just to be sure. That's also wise. Now, the king assures her and Mordecai that, hey, I'm on the side of the Jews. He realizes the Jews are out for his good, and Haman was out for his bad. He was against the Jews as his enemies. He wants to bless the Jews because he realized they've been a blessing to him. Saved his life, saved him from committing a terrible genocide. And Esther has done nothing but sought to do what pleased him the entire time he's been married to her. And they've been on his side, now he wants to be on their side. So he's finally wised up. So he gives some instructions here we see to take care of this problem in Esther chapter 8, 1 through 11. Write you also for the Jews as likes you, in the king's name, so the king's ring, the writing which is written in the king's name, and so the king's ring, that no man may reverse. And when the king's scribes called at that time in the 3rd month, as the month of Sivan, 23rd day thereof, it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded unto the Jews, and to the lieutenants and the deputies and the rulers of the province which are from India unto Ethiopia, 127 provinces, unto every province according to the writing thereof, and to the people after their language, to the Jews according to their writing, according to their language. He wrote in the King Ahasuerus' name, and so the king's ring, and sent letters by post on horseback, and riders on the mules, and camels, and young dromedaries. And when the king granted the Jews which were in the city to get themselves together, to stand for their life, to destroy and to slay, and to cause to perish all the power of the people in the province that would assault them, both little ones and women, and to take to spoil them for a prey. Now, first of all, a dromedary is a 1-amp camel, so these other camels are 2-amp camels. Remember, the king's empire goes all the way up to Uzbekistan, where Bactria is, where the 2-amp camels are called Bactrian camels. They can deal with a much colder climate than the dromedaries are more of a desert camel. And so that's why. So it shows you about the diversity of his land and about the diversity of meat, the diversity of animals need to deal with that. So everything's about diversity with the Persians. Just a little explanation there for you. So now the king says the Jews can fight back and stand for their lives. And whoever assaults them, whoever was wanting to assault them, can they instead of them getting the Jews stuff, the Jews can get their stuff. Okay. So he's totally wrote the opposite. He wrote basically what Haman's plan was, but flipped it with the Jews. Where the Jews are going to destroy their enemies instead of their enemies destroying the Jews. And he recognized that this, generally was a wise plan. And he's made sure. And I want you to notice it's the 3rd month. So this is 2 months. This is 2 months later. This is summer. This is the beginning of summertime when he does this. And that means, remember, the 12th month's when all this is going to go down. So there's 9 months for people to repent. and and change their minds and befriend the Jews. And it's gone out to the kings on the Jews' side. But let's see how this happens. Let's see what happens nonetheless. In Esther chapter 8, 13 through 17, we read this. The copy of a commandment was given on every province established to the people, and all the Jews were raised against the day to avenge themselves of their enemies. So the post rode out upon mules and camels and went out being hastened and pressed on the king's commandment. And the decree was given to Shushan the palace. And Mordecai went up in the prison of the king in royal apparel of blue and white, with a great crown of gold, and a garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province, in every city, wherever so the king's commandments decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a good day. And many people of the land became Jews, for the fear of the Jews fell upon them. It's worth noting that Mordecai's out in the colors of the Israeli flag. That's that's his robe is that color. The linen and the purple speak of royalty, okay? But that blue and white speak of Israel. And now the city of this makes sense to Shushan. They're glad. And they can avenge themselves. And I'm going to talk about why, and then we'll get to the last verse here in a moment. Talk about the wisdom there. So all this went out, and there's 9 months, but nonetheless, and all the king's men joined the side of the Jews, and so do a lot of other people. Nonetheless, the Jews still had to destroy 75,000 people outside of Shushan and 800 in Shushan. So those were at 9 months to go right and make things right between them and their Jewish neighbors. And they did not do it. It was foolish. But many of the people many of them were wise. And that gets us to our last verse down here. Our last verse, many of them became Jews, for the fear of the Jews fell upon them. Now, that means at the very least, now they could either become Jews through circumcision, or they could be uncircumcised. The Torah allowed for people to be uncircumcised, still count as part of the people of Israel. You can see it beginning in Exodus 12, where the commandment of Passover is first given. But either way, they became Jews. They either became strangers who were counted as part of the people of Israel, or they got circumcised or counted as if they were born in the land itself. And this means, at the bare minimum, they quit worshiping idols. And they quit doing a bunch of things. They started living by God's commandments. And in essence, in short, they became saved. Because remember, when I first started this whole series on wisdom, the purpose of wisdom, the fear of God is the cornerstone of all wisdom. He's the source of wisdom. But the purpose of wisdom, its ultimate purpose, is to win souls. In all these things that were done, God in his wisdom did it to bring many people to salvation who otherwise would not have come to salvation. And that's the ultimate wisdom in the book of Esther. That's all I have for you this week. Until next week, shalom.